It all started on a rainy Wednesday evening, the kind where everything feels off. The air was thick with unspoken tension, and I could feel it weighing down on both of us. My boyfriend, Mark, had been distant for weeks. He was home, but he wasn't really here, his mind was somewhere else. Our conversations had dwindled to nothing more than polite exchanges about dinner, work, or the weather. There were no real discussions, no laughter, no connection. Just silence. And that silence began to suffocate me. I had tried everything to bring us back to how we once were. I made small gestures, planned dinners, tried to engage him in conversations about things we both loved. But he was either too tired, too busy, or just indifferent. It felt like I was trying to revive a relationship that he had already emotionally checked out of. It's funny how, sometimes, we don't realize how far we've fallen until we reach the bottom. That night, I reached my breaking point. We were sitting on the couch in the living room, the sound of rain hitting the windows acting as the only backdrop to our strained silence. Mark had just gotten off the phone with someone, probably his work, or maybe a friend. I wasn't really sure, and at that moment, I didn't care anymore. I watched him, trying to gauge if he even noticed how much I was hurting. He didn't. And that was the worst part. He didn't even notice me. It was like I had become invisible to him. So, I snapped. I told him my phone had better men than you, I said, the words escaping my lips before I could stop them. They hung in the air, sharp and biting. I couldn't even believe I had said it out loud. It was a joke, or at least I tried to make it sound like one. A defense mechanism, maybe. A way to make him notice me, to get some kind of reaction. But as soon as the words left my mouth, I saw his face fall. His eyes darkened, his jaw clenched, and the space between us suddenly felt so much wider than before. It wasn't the reaction I expected. I didn't expect him to get hurt, at least, not that much. I thought he would laugh, maybe call me ridiculous, or even brush it off. But no. He stood up, his body stiff with anger. Then maybe you should go find one of them, he said, his voice cold and final. I froze. I didn't know what to say. My heart dropped, and the weight of my words crashed down on me. I had pushed him away, just like that, with a careless remark. I watched him grab his jacket and head for the door, the finality of his actions hanging heavy in the room. He was done. I'm serious, he said over his shoulder, not even looking at me. Maybe you're right. You deserve better. And with that, he was gone. I stood there, stunned, trying to process what had just happened. Was it really over? Could I have fixed this, or had I already lost him? I felt stupid. Empty. Alone. It's strange how one sentence, one careless, impulsive sentence, can change everything. The quiet of the room felt deafening now. I was alone, with nothing but the sound of my own regret echoing in the silence. The silence that followed his departure was suffocating. At first, I tried to deny it, telling myself that everything would be fine. He'd come back, right? He just needed some time to cool off. But as the hours turned into days, I realized how foolish that thought had been. He wasn't coming back. I kept staring at my phone, waiting for some kind of message, a call, anything. But there was nothing. Just a blank screen that mocked me with its emptiness. I found myself scrolling through old photos, remembering when things felt simple and good between us. The smiles, the laughter, the way we could talk for hours without running out of things to say. That all seemed so distant now. It was like we were two strangers caught in a relationship that was slowly dying. The first night without him was the hardest. I didn't even realize how much I had relied on his presence until it was gone. The bed felt so much bigger without him, and the house felt colder. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My words had triggered something in him, something deep and painful, and now I was facing the consequences of my careless remark. But was it just my words that ended it? Or had we been heading toward this breaking point for a while now, and I just hadn't noticed? Maybe I had ignored the signs, convinced that I could fix things, that I could keep us from drifting apart. The next morning, I woke up to an empty house. I went through the motions, brushing my teeth, getting dressed, making coffee, but everything felt like it was happening in a fog. The routine felt meaningless without him there, and the silence was deafening. Every time I reached for my phone, my stomach sank a little, expecting to see a message from him, but it never came. I spent the next few days avoiding my friends. I didn't want to talk to anyone about what had happened. How could I explain to them what I had done? How could I tell them that I had pushed him away with my own insecurities, my own doubts? I had told myself that I was just joking, but deep down, I knew it wasn't just a joke. It was a cry for attention, a desperate attempt to get him to notice me, to feel something. But I hadn't realized that what I was really doing was breaking us apart. I tried to distract myself with work, with errands, with anything that could fill the void. But the emptiness was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. I began to question everything, my relationship, my choices, and myself. Had I become someone I didn't recognize? Was I that person who pushed away the one person I loved, just to make a point? As the days passed, the guilt settled in like a heavy weight on my chest. I began to replay our last conversation over and over in my mind, wishing I could take back those words. Maybe if I hadn't said them, maybe if I had just been honest about how I was feeling, things could have been different. But there was no way to undo what had been done. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that it wasn't just about the breakup. It was about me, about my own insecurities, my fears, and my inability to communicate when I needed to. I had blamed him for our problems, but I had played a part in pushing him away. And now, I was left with nothing but the painful truth that sometimes, words can be more destructive than we ever realize. As the days passed, I found myself lost in thought. The silence had become unbearable. I was surrounded by people, friends, colleagues, even family, but I felt like I was drowning in my own mind. I couldn't shake the feeling of regret that clung to me like a second skin. The more I thought about the breakup, the more I realized how much of it was my own doing. It wasn't just the words I said in anger that had driven him away, it was the entire dynamic of our relationship that had slowly been eroded over time. I began to ask myself questions I hadn't wanted to confront before. How had we gotten here? How had I let things spiral out of control without even noticing? Mark had been different for a while, withdrawn, distracted, sometimes even distant, but I had ignored those signs. I convinced myself that he was just busy, or stressed, or going through a phase. I told myself that things would get better, that we just needed time. But in hindsight, I saw that the cracks had been there for months, maybe even longer. The more I reflected on our relationship, the more I saw the ways I had contributed to its downfall. It wasn't just the joke I made that night, though that was a clear turning point. It was the way I had allowed my insecurities to take over. I had always been afraid of being ignored, of not being good enough. And instead of talking to Mark about it, instead of being vulnerable and honest, I let my fears manifest in little ways: resentment, sarcasm, passive-aggressive comments. I had let my own insecurities dictate how I behaved, and in the process, I had pushed him further away. The thing was, I had never truly considered what Mark might have been going through. I had been so focused on my own feelings of neglect that I failed to see that he, too, might have been struggling. He wasn't perfect, but neither was I. We both had our flaws, our baggage, our issues. But instead of addressing them together, we had let them build up until they were too big to ignore. And I had never taken the time to understand his perspective. I had assumed that everything was about me, about my needs and my desires. I had been selfish. And then there was the guilt. The overwhelming, suffocating guilt that seemed to settle deep inside of me. I kept going over that night in my head, replaying the moment I had said those words. I told him my phone had better men than you. It wasn't just the phrase itself that haunted me, it was the look on his face when I said it. The shock, the hurt, the way his expression shifted from frustration to complete disillusionment. It was as if I had shattered something that was already fragile. I could have apologized right then, but I didn't. I let him walk away without even trying to fix it. As I sat in my room, alone with my thoughts, I realized something crucial. This wasn't just about losing him. It was about me losing myself. I had allowed my insecurities to shape my actions, and now I was left with the consequences. I couldn't keep blaming him for everything. The truth was, I had a part to play in the destruction of our relationship. And the only way I could move forward, whether it was with him or without him, was to acknowledge that. I needed to learn how to communicate better, how to express my feelings without hiding behind sarcasm and defensiveness. I needed to stop letting my fears dictate my actions. Most of all, I needed to learn how to trust, not just in him, but in myself. I had to start by forgiving myself for what I had done, and that was the hardest part. I was the one who had made the first move, and it was on me to fix the damage I had caused. After days of replaying the breakup in my mind, I realized that if I wanted closure, I had to take the first step. Sitting in silence and drowning in regret wouldn't fix anything. I had spent so much time convincing myself that I didn't need him, that I could move on, but deep down, I knew that I still cared. The truth was, I wasn't sure if we could fix what had been broken, but I had to try. I needed to reach out, not just to ask for his forgiveness, but to truly understand where things had gone wrong, to show him that I was willing to take responsibility for my actions. One morning, after days of wrestling with myself, I decided to send him a message. It wasn't easy, I almost backed out a dozen times, my thumb hovering over the send button as my heart raced. But I knew if I didn't do it, I'd regret it even more. I couldn't let pride be the reason we stayed apart forever. The message was simple, but it felt like the hardest thing I'd ever written. Mark, I know I've hurt you. I'm sorry for the things I said and how I made you feel. I wasn't thinking when I said those words, and I know I can't take them back. I want to talk, if you're willing to listen. It wasn't much, but it was honest. It was me acknowledging my mistakes and reaching out with no expectations other than to communicate. I didn't know how he would respond, or if he would even respond at all. But I had to try. For my own peace of mind, for the relationship we had once shared, and for the chance to grow as a person. The wait was agonizing. I spent hours refreshing my inbox, hoping to see a reply. But the minutes turned into hours, and the hours turned into days. It felt like an eternity, and I was tempted to give up, to convince myself that I had already done enough. But I reminded myself that healing, whether it was for our relationship or just for me, would take time. I couldn't rush it. I had to be patient. And then, finally, the message came. I've been thinking a lot about what you said. I've been hurt too, and I don't know if we can fix this, but I'm willing to talk. Relief flooded through me. It wasn't an instant reconciliation, and I knew we had a long road ahead, but this was a step. It was a small crack in the wall we had built between us, a glimmer of hope. We agreed to meet for coffee the next day. When I walked into the cafe, my heart was in my throat. I didn't know what to expect, whether he would be angry, indifferent, or open to talking. But when I saw him sitting there, his eyes tired but soft, something inside of me eased. We were both broken, but we were both willing to try. We talked, really talked, for the first time in weeks. It wasn't a perfect conversation. We didn't solve everything in that one sitting, but it was a start. We shared our feelings, our frustrations, and our fears. And for the first time in a long while, I felt heard. I felt like we were both seeing each other as human beings again, not just as two people stuck in a toxic cycle. It wasn't easy, and I knew it wouldn't be. But I also knew that taking this first step toward healing, whether as a couple or individually, was the only way forward. We weren't there yet, but at least we were talking. And that gave me hope. The weeks that followed our first conversation were filled with uncertainty, but they also brought small moments of clarity. We both knew that things couldn't go back to the way they were before. Our relationship, at least the way it had existed, was no longer sustainable. But that didn't mean it was over. It meant we had to rebuild, slowly, thoughtfully, and with a lot of hard work. We continued meeting for coffee, and with each conversation, we peeled back layers of what had gone wrong. It wasn't about blaming each other anymore. We had both made mistakes, both played a part in the breakdown of our relationship. But instead of pointing fingers, we decided to focus on understanding what had led us to this point. For me, it was a journey of self-discovery. I realized how much I had depended on his validation, how often I had used humor and sarcasm as a defense mechanism instead of being honest about my insecurities. I had learned to mask my vulnerability with words that cut deep, and it had hurt both of us. Mark, too, was learning. He admitted that he had withdrawn when things started to get tough, thinking that pulling away would protect him, but in reality, it had done the opposite. He had kept his emotions buried, afraid of confrontation and conflict, and that had caused a rift that only grew wider over time. We both acknowledged that we had failed to communicate properly, to ask for what we needed before it became too late. The truth was, we had both been broken individuals in need of growth. And this time, we weren't relying on each other to fix that. I couldn't depend on Mark to fill the gaps in my heart, just as he couldn't rely on me to be his emotional crutch. We had to learn how to be whole, independent people before we could even think about being in a healthy relationship again. Over time, we started to rebuild our foundation. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when we both questioned whether we were just clinging to something that was too far gone. But we also had moments of connection, small moments where we remembered why we had fallen in love in the first place. The laughter, the shared experiences, the understanding that had once existed between us. We began to appreciate each other in new ways, without the expectations or pressures that had weighed us down before. One day, as we sat across from each other at our usual cafe, Mark looked at me with a soft smile. "I don't know where this will lead," he said, his voice steady but sincere. "But I'm willing to keep trying, if you are." I couldn't help but smile back, feeling a mix of relief and hope. I wasn't sure where this new path would take us either. I wasn't even sure if we'd end up together in the end. But what I did know was that I wasn't afraid anymore. I had learned to accept my flaws, to confront my own insecurities head-on, and to take responsibility for the mistakes I had made. And I had learned that relationships were not just about avoiding conflict, but about being willing to face it together. We didn't jump back into things quickly. We took our time. We dated again, but it was different now. We were no longer two people trying to force something that wasn't working. We were two people learning to respect and care for each other in healthier ways. We communicated better, listened more, and, most importantly, we understood that love wasn't a one-time thing. It was a continuous effort, something that needed to be nurtured, something that had to evolve. Months later, I looked back at the journey we had been on, and I couldn't believe how far we had come. The pain of our breakup, the regret I had felt, and the moments of self-doubt had all led me to this point, a place of understanding, self-empowerment, and growth. I had learned to forgive myself, to accept responsibility for my actions, and to open my heart to the possibility of change. And whether Mark and I remained together or not, I had found something more important, a deeper understanding of who I was and what I truly needed. In the end, I had come to realize that sometimes, the hardest experiences lead to the most significant growth. And this was only the beginning.